Welcome to Deep Bear Sleep. If you're looking to relax and fall asleep fast, you're in the right place. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the sound of my voice take you deep into sleep. For more stories like this one, visit deepbearsleep.com. Now, let's begin.
Eleanor lay still on her side, facing the window. The street lamp cast a faint, elongated rectangle across the ceiling, a beacon she had come to rely upon in the deep hours. Her thumb moved over the worn ribbing of her left cuff, a comforting, almost unconscious gesture that brought a sense of order to the quiet space. It was a sweater she had owned for years, a blend of lamb's wool and cashmere, its familiar texture offering a small anchor in the gathering stillness of the room. The day's events began their familiar procession. The email from Mr. Harrison about the revised budget. Her words to him now felt clumsy, perhaps too direct for the delicate nature of the matter. Or not direct enough, leaving room for misinterpretation, for a nuance missed. She could have phrased it differently, chosen a more diplomatic opening, softened the edges of her critique. The thought settled, a small, persistent pebble in the calm pool of her mind, creating faint, concentric rings. Then the conversation with Alice, earlier that afternoon, regarding the garden club meeting. A misplaced emphasis on the rhododendrons, rather than the new rose bushes Alice was so keen to introduce. Alice had merely nodded, a pleasant expression on her face, but Eleanor felt a ripple of unexpressed concern, an imagined slight. These moments, small and seemingly insignificant, began to represent themselves with an insistent clarity. She knew these thoughts intimately. They arrived each night, a predictable procession of minor imperfections, of conversations replayed, of tasks imagined differently. Each one seemed to demand attention, a final polish, a different ending to its narrative. As if replaying them 100 times over could somehow alter the past or perfect the future. A curious feeling, this persistent hum behind her ears, a low thrumming that accompanied the parade of thoughts. She often wondered about its true purpose. Was it a way to process the day's intake, to sort and file the experiences? Or a rehearsal for tomorrow's challenges, a mental preparation? Yet tomorrow's challenges were rarely the exact replicas of today's, and the processing never seemed to conclude. The details simply presented themselves again, unchanged, unyielding, a loop that spun without resolution. She would watch them, like leaves caught in a small eddy on the surface of a wide river, circling, never moving downstream, never reaching the ocean. The room deepened its shadow around her, drawing the corners closer. But the thoughts continued their bright, unceasing dance. A persistent, internal current of thoughts continued its intricate pattern. Eleanor felt a subtle unease settling deeper into her bones, a faint stiffness in her shoulders, a tension she recognized from other nights like this. She turned onto her back, the mattress sighing faintly beneath her weight. The ceiling stretched above her, a vast, featureless expanse, now entirely dark as the street lamp outside had, at some point, ceased its vigil. The darkness held a different quality tonight, less comforting, more a canvas for the unspooling narratives in her head. Her fingers, still resting on the lamb's wool of her cuff, flexed once, then stilled. She reached her hand out, seeking the familiar edge of the bedside table, a boundary in the enveloping dark. Her fingertips brushed against the cool, smooth surface of a book, then a small, unexpected ridge. Not her usual reading material, not the well-worn poetry anthology that often resided there. This object felt different, solid and unyielding, yet inviting. Her fingers explored its contours in the darkness, tracing a simple rectangular form. The cover was plain, a sturdy, unassuming cardstock. It was a notebook, she realized, its pages neatly bound, its spine unmarked. She had no memory of placing it there. Next to it, her fingers found a pen, a simple ballpoint, smooth plastic, its cap already removed, as if waiting. A curious stillness settled around her, a pause in the relentless mental activity. The feeling of the notebook in her hand was substantial, a small, tangible presence in the quiet room. It held a certain weight, a promise of something unwritten. Her thumb, having left the comfort of her sweater cuff, now pressed against the blank cover, feeling the slight texture of the paper. A peculiar impulse bloomed within her, a quiet urge to shift her position, to turn on the small lamp on the table. She lifted the notebook, its pages cool against her palm. The pen felt balanced in her grip. The incessant loop of the day's conversations, the replayed moments, the unsaid words, they had not vanished entirely, but their sharp edges seemed to soften, to recede slightly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The blank page, illuminated now by the soft glow of the lamp, seemed to offer not a demand, but an invitation. It was a space entirely her own, where these circulating thoughts might find a different kind of home, a tangible form, away from the endless internal current. Observed the blankness of the page. It held a peculiar stillness, an unblemished expanse waiting for impression. The faint scent of new paper, a dry, woody aroma, rose to meet her. The pen in her hand felt light, a simple instrument, yet now imbued with an unfamiliar purpose. The email to Mr. Harrison surfaced again, its edges still defined, a persistent presence. She considered its exact phrasing, the precise words that had caused her internal replay. I find the revised budget to be overly optimistic. This was the crux. The phrase itself seemed to sit in the air before her, shimmering with unspoken implications. With a measured breath, Eleanor lowered the tip of the pen to the paper. A small, almost imperceptible line appeared, a dark mark against the cream surface. She wrote the date, not out of habit, but as a grounding gesture, an anchor in this new territory. Then the words. Revised budget, Mr. Harrison, overly optimistic. The ink flowed smoothly, creating crisp letters. She watched them form an external representation of what had, moments before, been a purely internal echo. A curious shift occurred. The thought, once held captive within the confines of her skull, now resided outside, a visible artifact. It no longer felt quite so pressing, no longer demanded her full, circling attention. It was simply there on the page, detached. A sense of quiet wonder began to spread through her. The act felt less like an analysis and more like a simple recording. The conversation with Alice about the garden club came next. The rhododendrons, Alice's pleasant nod, the imagined slight. Eleanor wrote, Alice, Rhododendrons versus roses. My emphasis. She did not elaborate, did not re-argue the point, did not attempt to refine the interaction. She merely transcribed the essence, the core of the repeated thought. And again, the thought, once transferred, seemed to release its hold. It became a neutral entry, a fact rather than a feeling. The pen moved across the page with an unhurried rhythm. The small details of the day, the minor anxieties, the half-formed plans, they presented themselves, one after another. A forgotten grocery item, basil for pesto. A small worry about the dripping faucet in the guest bathroom. Faucets, guest bath, check seal. Each inscription was a small act of disentanglement. The physical motion of her hand, the formation of letters, the faint scratching sound of the pen point on paper. These became anchors in the present moment, pulling her away from the eddying past. She filled the first page, then turned it. The blankness of the next page offered a fresh invitation. There was no judgment in the act, no need for perfect prose or profound insight. It was simply a transfer, an emptying. The constant hum behind her ears, the low thrumming that had accompanied the relentless parade of thoughts, began to diminish. It did not vanish entirely, not yet, but its intensity lessened, like distant music fading into the background. A space seemed to open within her mind, a new breadth where before there had been only a crowded thoroughfare. The initial resistance, a faint reluctance to engage with this unfamiliar ritual, had melted away. Now, the thoughts seemed to present themselves, almost cued, awaiting their turn on the page. She wrote about the book she'd been reading, a passage that had resonated, then slipped from her memory. Rilke, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. She wrote about the peculiar light filtering through the kitchen window at dusk, catching the dust motes in a particular dance. Dust motes in evening light. Kitchen. These were not concerns, not problems to be solved, but observations, small fragments of the day that her mind had held on to. The act of naming them, of giving them a physical presence, seemed to grant them a different kind of existence. They were no longer looping internal commands, but discrete entities cataloged. Her thumb no longer sought the comfort of her left sweater cuff. Her fingers remained steady on the pen, the smooth plastic warm beneath her grip. The glow from the bedside lamp cast a gentle circle around her, a small island of illumination in the room. She noticed the slight indentation her pen had made on the pages beneath, a testament to the accumulating weight of her transcribed thoughts. As more pages filled, a new understanding began to unfold. It was not about solving anything, not about finding a perfect resolution for the day's perceived errors. It was about creating distance. The thoughts, once urgent and immediate, now appeared on the page like specimens under a microscope. She could examine them, acknowledge them, and then, with the turning of a page, move on. The mental spaciousness expanded, a palpable sense of release. The feeling was akin to decluttering a crowded room, piece by piece, until the floor became visible again and the air moved freely. The stream of consciousness, once a swirling vortex, became a river flowing onto the page. There was no effort involved in recalling the next thought. It simply presented itself, clear and distinct. She recorded a fleeting memory of her grandmother's garden, the scent of petunias, after a summer rain. Grandmother's petunias, rain. A conversation snippet from a radio program she'd heard that morning. Radio article on ancient navigation. Even these seemingly random details, once externalized, contributed to the sense of an internal clearing. Nocturnal replay, the relentless, circling thoughts, had subsided. There was no frantic searching for solutions, no replay of imagined dialogues. The mind, instead of chasing its own tail, was now simply emptying its contents onto the page. A calming presence settled within her, a deep satisfaction that filled the spaces where the insistent loops had once resided. Her gaze remained fixed on the expanding landscape of her written words, an external map of her internal unfurling. The pen continued its steady work, an extension of her own awareness, transforming the ephemeral into the tangible, one deliberate stroke at a time. The room around her seemed to deepen its stillness, holding her in this newfound expanse of clear thought. Eleanor's fingers, now accustomed to the pen's weight, moved with a steady purpose. The expanding landscape of her words spread across the creamy pages, an ordered record of the day's intake. Each transcribed detail, whether a concern or a simple observation, contributed to a growing sense of composure. The faint scratching sound of the pen point on paper filled the air, a small, consistent punctuation to the silent unraveling of her thoughts. The physical act of forming each letter, of watching the ink bloom on the page, held her attention, drawing her fully into the present moment. The internal current, once so insistent, now flowed out, making its path across the paper. She paused, the pen hovering above the page. The entry about her grandmother's petunias lingered in her awareness. A distant image surfaced, unbidden, from her earliest childhood summers. Her grandmother, Clara Vance, possessed a particular habit. Each evening, after dinner, she would sit at the small oak table in her sunroom, a worn leather-bound book open before her. It was not a diary, nor a journal of events. Instead, Clara would methodically list the small occurrences of her day. Not grand happenings, but the almost imperceptible shifts. The way the light fell through the kitchen window at precisely 4:17, painting a brief stripe across the flower bin. The exact shade of blue on a robin's egg she had found near the hydrangeas. The taste of the first ripe strawberry from the patch by the stone wall. She called these her small treasures, and the act of writing them down, Clara often explained, helped her to put the day to bed, all neat and tidy. Eleanor remembered the peculiar calm that always seemed to emanate from her grandmother during these sessions. Clara's brow would smooth, her shoulders would relax, and a distinct air of peaceful completion would settle around her. She never analyzed these entries, never revisited them for solutions or regrets. They were simply placed, acknowledged, and then allowed to rest within the pages of the ledger. The book itself, filled with Clara's precise looping script, became a repository of these ephemeral moments, a physical manifestation of a day truly lived and then fully released. Memory, surfacing now in the illumination of her bedside lamp, resonated deeply with Eleanor's current experience. The act of writing for her grandmother was not about problem solving, but about formalizing the day's intake, giving each fragment its proper place before relinquishing its hold. It was a conscious, gentle act of completion. Eleanor recognized the same pattern unfolding within her. She was not dissecting her worries. She was simply placing them. The email, the conversation with Alice, the forgotten Basil. They were no longer insistent demands on her attention, but discrete items, laid out for inspection, then set aside. Her pen returned to the page, its tip poised. The next thought that surfaced was about the conversation with her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, earlier that morning. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned the impending town council meeting and her concerns about the proposed zoning changes for the old mill property. Eleanor had nodded, offering vague assurances, but internally, a small eddy of anxiety had begun to form. Town council, mill property zoning, Mrs. Henderson's worry. She wrote it down. The simple inscription seemed to lift the weight of the potential future concern, transforming it from an amorphous dread into a defined entry. The sense of internal space continued to expand. It felt like walking through a house where the furniture had been rearranged, opening up new pathways, allowing light into previously shadowed corners. The buzzing behind her ears, the low thrumming that had been her constant companion on restless nights, had now receded to an almost imperceptible background hum, a distant, fading echo. The mind, once a crowded room, felt like an empty canvas, ready for the brush, rather than cluttered with yesterday's sketches. Eleanor found herself writing about the precise pattern of frost on her window pane that morning, a delicate lace against the gray sky. Frost pattern, window pane. She described the particular way her cat, Jasper, stretched each morning, a long, languid arch of his back, tail twitching before settling into his breakfast. Jasper's morning stretch. These observations, devoid of urgency or consequence, flowed onto the paper with the same ease as the more pressing concerns. They all shared a common destination, the page where they could exist, external and separate. The feeling was one of profound decompression. The mind, no longer needing to actively hold on to these fragments, could release its grip. It was a physical sensation, a loosening in her chest, a softening of the muscles around her eyes. The pen continued its slow dance across the paper. The accumulated pages, a growing stack to her left, represented not a burden, but a liberation. Each filled page was a breath exhaled, a small act of letting go. Drifted momentarily from the page to the small wooden bird carved by her father, resting on the bedside table. It was a robin, its breast painted a cheerful rust, its eye a tiny bead of black glass. Her father had spent hours in his workshop, shaping wood, transforming raw material into defined forms. He would often speak of the architecture of creation, how each piece, no matter how small, needed its own distinct space, its own specific purpose to truly exist. He believed that holding too many ideas in the mind without giving them form was like trying to carry too many loose tools in one's pockets. They would only clatter and impede movement. This second memory, layered over the first, reinforced the understanding. Both Clara and her father, in their distinct ways, had practiced a form of externalization, a way of giving shape and place to the internal world. Clara, with her daily ledger of observations, her small treasures, and her father, with his carvings, his architecture of creation. The notebook in Eleanor's hands felt like a contemporary echo of these ancestral practices. She was not merely writing down thoughts. She was, in a sense, building a structure for them, giving them definition and boundaries, allowing them to stand distinct from the core of her being. The pen's movement became almost automatic, a seamless extension of her inner landscape. The desire to replay conversations, to re-examine decisions, had simply evaporated. The insistent questions, what if, should I have, no longer presented themselves. There was only the steady flow of thought onto the page and the expanding expanse of the mind. The room felt immense, filled with a pervasive stillness that was no longer an empty void, but a rich, resonant presence. Her breathing deepened, each inhale drawing in the quiet air, each exhale releasing any lingering vestiges of internal clutter. She observed the faint sheen on the paper where the ink had dried, a testament to the word's permanence. They were not gone, but transformed, residing now in a place of their own. Her hand, no longer reaching for the familiar comfort of her sweater cuff, found a different kind of reassurance in the substantial weight of the notebook and the pen. The act had become a ritual, a profound reorientation. The world of her inner thoughts had found its external architecture, and in doing so, had found its peace. The lamp cast its steady light, a beacon not just in the deep hours, but in the newly cleared spaces of her Eleanor's fingers, accustomed to the pen's weight, moved with steady purpose. The landscape of her words spread across the pages, an ordered record. Each transcribed detail contributed to a growing sense of composure. The faint scratching sound of the pen filled the air, a consistent punctuation to the unraveling of her thoughts. The physical act of forming each letter, watching the ink bloom, held her attention, drawing her fully into the present. The internal current, once so insistent, now flowed out across the paper. She paused, pen hovering. A distant image surfaced from childhood summers. Her grandmother, Clara Vance, possessed a particular habit. Each evening, Clara would sit at her sunroom table, a worn ledger open. She listed the small occurrences of her day. The light through the kitchen window, the shade of a robin's egg, the taste of the first ripe strawberry. She called these her small treasures, explaining that writing them down helped her to put the day to bed, all neat and tidy. Eleanor remembered the peculiar calm emanating from her grandmother. Clara's brow would smooth, her shoulders relax. She never analyzed these entries, simply placed, acknowledged, and allowed them to rest. This memory, surfacing now, resonated deeply. The act of writing for her grandmother was not about problem solving, but formalizing the day's intake, giving each fragment its proper place before relinquishing its hold. It was a conscious, gentle act of completion. Eleanor recognized the same pattern unfolding within her. She was not dissecting worries. She was simply placing them. The email, the conversation with Alice, the forgotten basil, they were no longer insistent demands on her attention, but discrete items, laid out for inspection, then set aside. The physical act had become a form of quiet release. The pen, a familiar weight, now rested between her fingers. She had filled several pages, her small, neat script forming columns of details. Each word, each line, a small act of externalization. The insistent current, the low thrumming behind her ears, had diminished. It was no longer a frantic hum, but a distant, almost imperceptible echo. The mind, once a crowded thoroughfare, now felt like a wide, open field under a vast sky. She placed the pen beside the notebook on the bedside table. The lamp cast its steady light on the accumulated pages, a tangible record of her day's intake. She no longer felt the urge to smooth the left cuff of her sweater. Her hand rested open on the lamb's wool, relaxed. The room held its breath around her. The street lamp outside, which had been dark earlier, now flickered on, painting a faint, elongated rectangle across the ceiling. It was the same beacon she had come to rely upon. But tonight, its presence brought a different sensation. There was no replay of Mr. Harrison's email, no re-examination of Alice's nod. The thoughts simply were not there, not circling, not demanding. They had found their place on the paper. Profound stillness settled within her. The previous tension in her shoulders had softened, melted away. Her breathing deepened, each inhale drawing in the clear air, each exhale a sigh of release. The bed no longer felt like a staging ground for mental battles, but a true place of rest. The usual procession of minor imperfections, of conversations replayed, of tasks imagined differently, it had simply ceased. The eddy of leaves had disappeared. The river now flowed freely. The silence in her mind was not an empty void, but a resonant spaciousness, a receptive expanse. She closed her eyes, feeling the gentle weight of the blanket. The room deepened its shadow around her, drawing the corners closer, but the internal current had vanished, leaving behind a tranquil sea. The street lamp's glow, a familiar companion, now painted its rectangle with an air of settled peace. Eleanor felt the deep, steady rhythm of her own breath, each expansion of her chest a testament to the emerging order within. The clamor of the day, the insistent demands for reprocessing, had receded completely. Her mind, once a bustling marketplace, was now an expansive meadow under a moonlit sky, vast and unburdened. A profound lightness permeated her limbs, as if unseen anchors had been lifted. Her muscles, which had unknowingly held tension throughout the day, now yielded, becoming pliant against the mattress. The coolness of the air on her skin, the texture of the sheets against her cheek. These sensations registered without demand, simply existing. The lamp on the bedside table cast its circle of warmth, a small, welcoming sun in the encompassing dark. Her eyelids grew heavy, a natural surrender, drawing down the last vestiges of external awareness. There was no resistance, no fight against the inevitable descent. Instead, a welcoming drift began, a slow, sustained float downwards, towards deeper levels of rest. The very fabric of the room seemed to cradle her, holding her securely in this newfound tranquility. The low hum of the house, a distant, almost imperceptible sound, merged with the growing stillness inside her. The thoughts had found their architecture, and she, in turn, had found her feeling of profound peace filled the spaces where the circling thoughts had once resided. Her awareness, no longer tethered to concerns or replays, drifted free, like a feather carried on an evening current. The contours of the bed seemed to mold around her, a perfect fit for a body at ease. She felt the warmth radiating from the mattress, a comfort that sank into her bones. The last conscious flicker of the day, the lingering sensation of the pen in her hand, now dissolved into the pervasive calm. The room's presence was no longer merely a container, but an extension of her own serenity. She imagined the words on the pages, each one a closed door, holding its specific detail, allowing her mind to remain open and clear. The long exhalation of her breath carried away any final traces of yesterday's attachments, leaving only the promise of uninterrupted repose. This peaceful descent, this profound liberation from the mind's incessant loops, felt like a homecoming.
Until next time, sleep well.